Welcome back, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us again today on Board Shorts. My name is Ben Brooks. I'm the Managing Director here at Agency Express. This is your bite-sized guide to becoming a franchised operator. Today, we've got something a little bit special. I'm bringing a guest in for you to talk all about the legal side of what we do. She's an absolute legend in the franchise industry, so we're very, very lucky to have her on, even if it's only for 15 minutes. So, Natalia, do you want to introduce yourself? Perhaps that's the best way we start.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. So my name is Natalia and I am a franchise lawyer. Although what I like to say to people is that I make people's dreams come true. Um,
Oh, that's nice. I never heard
I
it put
know.
that way. I'm
Well,
just
it's
used to getting the
because
bills for the solicitors, that's all.
well, and the reason I say that is because I'm very passionate about franchising, as you know, and I work with some franchisors, but quite a lot of franchisees. And I see people at every stage of their journey. So when they first come into franchising, um, throughout, and then the bit about dreams is because, you either can expand and do more, or if it's time to sell, you can recoup your investment, sell up, and
Yeah.
do other wonderful things. And for me, it's so nice to see people succeed and, and come to that end that they had in
Yeah.
mind and be able to leave franchising having achieved what they what they set out to achieve. So,
Yeah. The whole journey. Absolutely. So I thought today it might be really nice to start right at the beginning. And I think this is something that a lot of people get very nervous about when they get into the franchise due diligence phase.
mhm.
People are very good at assessing, what they want to do and the kind of businesses they want to work in. But as soon as it gets to the legal bit, I think it gets a bit scary. And a lot of that's to do with language and, we have to write things in a certain way. But perhaps let's start at the beginning. What is a franchise agreement? Why do we have them? Why do we have to have the franchise agreement in the first place?
Well, the reason we have to have a franchise agreement is because essentially it's the key document that governs that relationship between a franchisor and a franchisee. Um, I think thing number one that I'm keen for my clients to understand is that when you come to to become a franchisee, it is a time limited relationship. You're given a system, you're given a business, but you're borrowing the franchisor's name. You're borrowing that system for a period of time, right? And so there are certain expectations, there are certain obligations that come with it. And if it's not documented very clearly, then that's when problems arise. So to avoid issues and to avoid problems, you need to make sure that everyone is on the same page. And the best way to do that is to have a document that very clearly sets out how that relationship is going to be governed. Things like, what you need to do at the very beginning as a franchisee, what you can expect the franchisor to provide to you, and then the same again throughout the life of that agreement, so the term of the franchise, what is expected from you and what can you expect from the franchisor. And then equally, because it's usually an investment, sometimes it can be quite a significant investment, so you need to know, well, what happens at the end, right? So when my 5 years, for example, are up, what happens next? How do I renew? What do I need to do if I want to carry on? If I don't want to carry on, how can I sell? How can I recoup my investment? And of course, we also have to cover sort of worst case scenarios. So what happens if the franchisee has done something naughty, what can the franchisor do? Because at the end of the day, the franchisor has to protect not just the brand and their own name, because, franchisees are using the franchisor's name, but also the rest of the network. So,
Yeah.
if I was a franchisee, which I am actually, I want to know that other franchisees within the network will be subject to the same conditions, and that the franchisor is actually policing that and keeping people accountable, because I don't want to do really well and then find out that my neighbor has done something very bad, and as a result of their actions, I'm going to suffer. So it works both ways.
Yeah. I've often heard it discussed as a prenup. It's a bit like, I think of the franchise relationship very much like a marriage, that the franchisee and the franchisor, it's a shared goal. We're aiming for the same thing, success for both parties.
Yep.
And the franchise agreement is your prenup. It's setting out the rules of engagement, how we're both going to look after each other, how we're both going to work for each other, but also what we're not going to do and the direction of travel.
That's
Do
a
you
good
agree
way
with
of
that?
looking at it. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, absolutely. I think this is it. The franchisor can only be successful if they have successful franchisees, right?
Yeah,
So
100%.
there is a codependency because the franchisor will have nothing if they don't have franchisees, but the franchisees are relying on the franchisor. So there is this codependency. Both can be successful if the other one is doing what they're supposed to be doing and
Yeah.
pulls their weight.
Yeah. It's one of the things you get to do a lot. You see a lot of franchise agreements, don't you? And this is obviously for franchisors, for franchisees as well. And something that I always encourage our franchisees to do when they come through the due diligence process is to get our agreement checked by a solicitor, by a lawyer, because
Yep.
often the language can be confusing. It can be structured and written in such a way that it's legally correct, but not perhaps good bedtime reading. So what are your common things that people miss? What do they need to watch out for when they're looking at these agreements?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think actually it could be good bedtime reading because it can certainly, some
Maybe for
agreements
you.
can
Yeah,
certainly
maybe for
put
you.
you to sleep.
Yes, true,
um,
true. Yes.
but yeah, you're right. It can be tricky to navigate if you're not used to that sort of language and because it's a legal document, there'll be such things as defined terms, and then as you're reading it, you have to be very clear, what does that mean? If something is with a capital letter, it's a specific term and you have to understand what that term is, etc. So I mean, the best thing you can do is, as you say, get legal advice from the right person. There are lawyers who are who specialize in franchising, who do this all the time, and they will be able to essentially translate it into layman's terms, explain it in plain English, and just walk a prospective franchisee through it to explain this is what it means. This is standard within the industry, and this is what you can expect. And likewise, if there is something unusual, the lawyer would typically be able to pick that up and say, that this is not standard, this is unusual, or I'm not convinced that this would work.
So
So
what would you suggest for them to watch out for if they had, what's a big red flag? If you just pick one thing out of the hat, what's something that would jump out at you as you'd underline it in red for them to go and have a look at?
well, it's difficult to say. I would say there are a number of things that can do that. And obviously, for me, a point that I would highlight and, a concern would be if, if the terms were not clear about, allocated territory. And, we talk about exclusivity, and often where you are a franchise system where you have allocated territories, I would expect the agreement to say that, for as long as you comply with the terms of the agreement, the franchisor is not going to operate within that allocated territory themselves, and they're not going to let anyone else, be in that territory.
Yeah.
So you do have sort of exclusivity, if you like, within certain parameters.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
sometimes you
And
see franchisors sometimes if the first limb is not there, so if it only says like the franchisor won't grant anyone else the right to that territory, but the
mm,
first bit is missing, that franchisor won't themselves go into there, then potentially you could end up with franchisor competing with the franchisee, which,
sure.
from a franchisee's point of view, is a bit of a concern because the franchisor has
Yeah.
access to all of your information, and then you are now competing with the franchisor. So if that's not what you're expecting, then that can be, I guess, quite
That'd be a big
unsettling.
red flag.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's so important to get legal advice, isn't it? It's those little detailed elements that a normal human, a muggle like us, may not pick up on, but someone with legal experience is going to spot straight away. Okay, so what about right of renewal? I think this is something that is often lost. A common question I get asked is, "Oh, do I have the right to renew my business?" And be interested to get your take on that. On the right of renewal, I think is a really important part of franchising.
Yeah, absolutely it is. And again, a lot depends on the wording. So do you have the right to renew, or is that conditional? So often, and rightly so, it will be conditional, it'll be conditional upon you meeting certain criteria. So are you compliant? Because if you're not, if you're not compliant, if you're not doing well, then why would the franchisor want to carry on with that relationship? So,
Mm.
but you also then need to look at the details. So some agreements, for example, say you only have the right to renew twice, and then
Hmm.
you don't anymore. So the question arises, well, what happens then? If you're doing well, why wouldn't the franchisor agree to carry on? So
Sure.
commercially, it makes no sense. But from a franchisor's perspective, it may be that at that point they kind of go, well, you've had, 15 years, and now we can come to the table and renegotiate, and it's completely so sort of open as to what we want to do next. Or, also franchisor might want to have some flexibility. Maybe they need to have flexibility if they want to stop franchising, if they,
Mm.
if something else comes up, because as much as we want to believe we know what's going to happen in the future, we don't have a crystal ball. So, but yeah, renewal, um, you absolutely want to know, how can I renew and what will happen? So what are the conditions, and what is the criteria that I need to meet in order for me to be able to renew?
Yeah, sure. Okay. And then I think something else I get asked quite a lot, and I'm always a point of pointing this out to someone about restrictive covenants, a turn of phrase that we get very used to in
Yep.
franchising, but again is quite unusual in the sort of in the normal world, in the muggle world, shall we say? So, how would you define what a restrictive covenant is?
Okay, so a restrictive covenant is essentially prevents you from doing the same thing in competition with, the brand, with the franchisor, for a period of time. So essentially, it's protecting the franchisor's interests, which again, like I say, it's fair enough, right? And it's standard in our industry, in franchising, because if you're coming along and you've never done this, and the franchisor trains you, they literally give you the business system, and they say, if you do X, Y, Z, this works. So they train you, they basically fast track you to success. And therefore, when the relationship ends, it's fair enough that the franchisor should have a protected period of time during which they know that you won't be competing against them.
Yeah.
So what we typically tend to see is, restrictive covenants. So restriction preventing you from competing with the franchisor for a period of 12 months after the relationship has ended. And that typically would look like, you won't compete in that area. You won't poach customers or employees, that sort of thing. But one thing I would like to say, because I think, again, that spooks a lot of people, um,
Mm.
is that those restrictions generally will apply not just to, you as an individual, but also will apply to typically sort of anyone who's related to you, etc. And again, it's because in the past we have had situations where naughty franchisees decided, what, I can do this better than, without the franchisor. They looked at the contract. The contract said, well, you cannot compete for 12 months. So they ran, oi, girlfriend or wife, why don't we put the business in your name and you do it, but I will actually do it. So, to prevent people from basically getting around that,
Yeah.
restrictions apply
Loopholes.
wider
Yeah.
than just the
Absolutely.
person. And that's standard. And the other thing
Yeah.
I mention, obviously, is that I think, again, which can sometimes unsettle prospects, is personal guarantee.
Mm.
Um,
Yes, definitely.
I think people are generally quite, don't want to be liable and on the hook. But again, I would always explain and say, but look, it's fair enough. You are literally incorporating a brand new company that has zero assets, and the value of which is £1. So, the franchisor wants to know that if the company does something wrong, that they can come after you. But it's
Mm.
for you, you can protect yourself, because the franchisor can only come after you if you've done something wrong. So
Exactly.
if you play
Yeah.
ball and you do things right, and you don't cause the franchisor to suffer a loss, then your liability will be limited to nothing, to zero,
Yeah.
because you are playing
And
ball.
you hit the point perfectly before, didn't you? That it's about those around you as well. That the franchise system works because everyone's playing by the rules.
Yeah.
And that's the same for all franchise groups across the whole country, across the whole of the world, that if everyone follows the rules, it's fair and equitable and everyone benefits. If you get someone who steps outside of those rules, that's the only time that franchise agreement is going to come out of the drawer and need to be checked, because it's important that everyone is playing fair. I always compare this to Monopoly when I have a franchise interview with someone and say, well, look, if we're playing Monopoly and everyone's playing fair, but you keep nicking money from the bank, so you can win, then you're going to say that's not fair, right? Oh yeah, of course I get. Okay, right. So that's essentially what the franchise agreement is. It's just the rules, it's the
Yeah.
guidelines, and if we follow it, and everyone sticks with the rules, then everything makes sense. Okay, last thing then, because you're far too busy to speak to me all day, is about resale. That I think
Mhm.
again, this is something that often gets overlooked: the importance of the ability to actually sell your business. Part of
Yeah.
being a true franchise is that you own an asset, that you can sell it. Is that something that you see confusion with in agreements when people are talking to you about them?
I will say no, I don't. I mean, I don't tend to see a
Okay,
lot of confusion because, I mean, I suppose majority of the agreements I've looked at do typically contain that provision. And yeah, you're absolutely
good.
right. At the end of the day, you are building an asset, and the best way out of franchising is always via a sale, because if you've done things right, you've built an asset that is valuable, so therefore you should be able to benefit from that. And again, it's just important to understand how it will work, what's expected, and what fees you will have to pay. So I think sometimes people can get caught out because they either forgot or didn't appreciate what will be payable, because when they are first starting, 5% of zero is zero, right? But
Yeah,
5% of a
sure.
million is not something to be, to be sniffed at. So it can be quite a lot of money. So I think, it's important that you understand what the resale process looks like and what the fees that may be payable that will apply.
Yeah, and having that plan from the start, isn't it? So, thinking about the exit right at the start. So when that agreement is signed, it's not just about building and running a fantastic business. It's also thinking, okay, well, is it 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20? What point do I want to exit? And it doesn't mean that plan can't change, but if you prepared for it on day one, then there's no surprises further down the line when you start to do those numbers on your spreadsheet, and yeah, no, they get a bit bigger than the cell that they're in. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Natalia, thank you so much for your time today, for joining us. We've gone over 15 minutes, which is I have a habit of
Sorry.
doing. But no, it's normally me. It's normally my fault. But hopefully, for anyone listening, that gives them a bit of an insight into franchise agreements and what they are. Obviously, if you want to speak to a franchise lawyer who knows what they're doing, please reach out to Natalia. I'll put her details in the link description at the bottom. But I think that all that's left for me to say is join us again for another episode of Board Shorts soon. And thank you, Natalia, and have a good rest of your day.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much.